for making it out to such an early session. I am so excited to be here to talk with you today about my passion, which is academic underachievement, and specifically developmental pathways in underachievement. So just as a brief overview, I'm not going to spend the entire time talking about my dissertation, so I've embedded it in explaining a little bit about what underachievement is, the idea of multiple pathways or a person-centered approach, how the questions we ask matter for the research we do and the way we think about these things, and then talk a little bit about how I see this fitting within my broader program of research, so implications for interventions and how I move forward with this. So since I'm talking about developmental pathways, I need to explain a little bit about my own developmental pathway to give you some context for my ideas. So several years ago, I arrived at Duke University, super excited, aren't we all when we first started, right? To do research on gifted students and academic underachievement. My mother was the gifted education specialist for many years. And I remember when I started my PhD program, she said, I really want you to fix this underachievement thing. So if you could just do that in grad school, that would be great. No pressure, Mom. Okay, I'll try to do that in 5 years. But luckily, I got paired up with a wonderful advisor. So I had the great fortune to work with Dr. Lisa Garcia. So when I came to grad school, I knew almost nothing about motivation. That was quickly fixed in 5 years. And it's also through Lisa I learned more about this person-centered approach, this idea of multiple pathways. And I can trace my thinking back to Lisa's own graduate work. So Lisa completed her PhD at the University of Michigan. Trivia question time. Who did Lisa work with? Who was her advisor? Anyone know?
Paul Pintrich.
Paul Pintrich, exactly. So Paul Pintrich also wrote extensively about this idea of multiple pathways, more than one way to achieve, looking at motivation holistically. So this is also part of why I'm so honored to receive this award, is because my grand advisor was Paul Pintrich. And it reminds me really that we do stand on the shoulders of giants. We need to give credit to where our thinking comes from. So, because it is a 9 a.m. talk, you might not have had coffee yet, let's have a brief moment of audience participation. Oh no, I didn't think I was going to have to think, right? What is academic underachievement? Take 3 seconds, think about your own idea. We all have ideas about what this word means to us. And now let's get a brave soul who would like to volunteer their definition of academic underachievement.
Accomplishing far less than you're capable of.
Okay. Who had a definition similar to that? Pretty good. So it looks like we're pretty much on the same page. So when I talk about academic underachievement, like other underachievement researchers, at the heart of this idea is this idea of discrepancy between what someone can do and what they actually do. I have quotations around these very loaded words, right? Ability, achievement. But we're talking about a discrepancy. So it's not someone achieving less than other people achieve, but what you personally can achieve. So we're going to use a little bit of a conceptual graph to kind of sort this through. So some people do actually measure underachievement this way to kind of think of it as an idea. So if we take achievement, I know, whatever that is, and we hypothetically regress it on ability, we get this expected level of achievement for every level of ability. So if you fall within this range, we say that you're achieving. Now at the high end, if you have really high ability and really high achievement, that would be like all of my Division 15 friends. So very brilliant, very accomplished. Let's look at the other bottom. Low levels of ability, low achievement. That would be me in a Zumba class. Pretty terrible, and I have absolutely no Zumba ability. Anything that falls below this line is said to be underachieving. Your actual achievement is less than what would be expected given your level of ability. Reference from pop culture, if anyone has seen Good Will Hunting, Matt Damon's character. Brilliant, working as a janitor at MIT. Or you can think of a student who gets perfect score on the SATs but gets all D's and F's in school. So that's what we mean by underachievement. And then, less common, but above this line you're said to be overachieving. Your level of actual achievement is higher than what would be expected given your ability. So a frequent question we get when we talk about these things is, okay, is underachievement really different from low achievement? And there's been limited work looking at this, but there is evidence to suggest that indeed the discrepancy does matter. So McCall and colleagues compared underachieving with non-underachieving students, and when they compared them, they controlled for grades. So what you're doing is you're isolating, just having that discrepancy matter. And it did. So parents of the underachieving students perceived them to be higher in ability than non-underachieving while controlling for grades. So this definitely warrants future replication, but it's some evidence that having this discrepancy matters. There is a syndrome of underachievement. And research on underachievement has been conducted since about the 1950s, really attracted a lot of attention. So what do we know? And what we know can really be summed up by we know a whole lot and we know almost nothing. There are mixed findings everywhere. It's a mess. So if we think about value beliefs, typically underachieving students, less satisfaction with school and teachers, don't really care about academics. They can be motivated by grades, but they also don't have so much value in grades. And when we look at even the standard deviation for value, it's huge. They're just all over the place. If we look at competence beliefs, they have lower academic self-concept. But wait, no, they don't have lower academic self-concept. They have these maladaptive attributions. But wait, no, they don't have these maladaptive attributional patterns. It's just complex. So as I'm digging through this as a graduate student, I'm thinking, there is no puzzle. I can't answer my mom's demand to fix underachievement. It's a disaster. And I started paying attention to all these differences rather than looking for a common solution. So we started running across all these observations of heterogeneity. So people have been trying to fix underachievement with interventions since the 50s. They started making all these observations. The interventions kind of worked, but differently, and there seem to be these subtypes. So maybe there's these different kinds of underachievers. Sylvia Rim came up with 16 different kinds based on her clinical observations. And some researchers started noting standard deviations are large. There's so much variability here. And in trying to reconcile this variability, I started to pay attention to the questions that are being asked. So this quote comes from a seminal paper on underachievement, where the question asked is about directionality of variables. Does A cause B, B cause A, or does C cause A and B? And you would think that covers all the bases, but sitting in Lisa's lab, listening to all these things about multiple pathways and person-centered, I started to wonder, maybe this isn't the right question to be asking at all for this phenomenon. Maybe what we need is a person-centered, or what some people call a profile-centered approach. And so in 2013, Lisa and I published this paper where we argue for taking a person-centered approach to underachievement. As opposed to a variable-centered approach, where you focus on variables like self-concept, underachievement, here we're looking at people. So variables exist holistically within people. The focus is more on describing rather than generalizing to a whole population, so you carefully generalize. So you look for patterns and generalize carefully to individuals who are similar. We get these principles of equifinality, taking different paths to the same outcome. Multifinality, starting in the same place, but diverging. And then what I think is really cool, white spots and antitypes. What patterns don't we see? What pathways don't we see? So taking these principles, maybe now we can start to solve this very complex picture of academic underachievement. So the question, rather than asking, what predicts underachievement, what causes underachievement, we're instead asking, are there multiple pathways in underachievement? So we're really changing the questions, and the questions have sort of stayed the same since the 50s. So coming at it more of like a mean level comparison approach, what differentiates, what predicts. So we're shifting the questions. Instead of looking motivational beliefs, predicting underachievement status, we're looking at underachievement as a trajectory in itself alongside motivational beliefs. Instead of grouping underachievers and looking, do they differ based on gifted status or gender, we're asking, do these different pathways relate to these variables? And then instead of, here's your two groups, achieving, underachieving, how do they relate to outcomes, we're asking, does the pathway that you take in underachievement relate to different outcomes? So we're really shifting all these questions on themselves. Which leads to my dissertation study. So the issue when you ask these great questions, you realize that you have to take kind of a complicated statistical approach. So these big questions that we're asking, looking at underachievement, instead of thinking it as something stagnant within a person, so instead of using the word underachiever, thinking it as something that develops itself. So it's either this growing or sustained discrepancy between your ability and your achievement. I did take a domain-specific approach to this, so rather than looking globally for my dissertation, I just looked at underachievement in reading. And then in thinking about influences on underachievement, drawing from important constructs in achievement motivation. So self-concept or perceptions of confidence, how important is reading, psychological cost value, the worry associated with not doing well in reading, and then a global factor of global self-worth, how proud I feel of myself. Gender is also an important predictor when we think about underachievement. So ironically, the one consistent finding that we usually get in underachievement research is that males are much more likely to be underachieving than females. And then taking this through a longitudinal person-centered approach. So not just looking at different patterns, but patterns and changes over time. So in order to do this, we pieced it into 3 different questions. First, we looked at these joint trajectories and how underachievement develops alongside motivational beliefs. What predicts these trajectories, and then what are the outcomes of these different trajectories? So the predictors included gender, gifted status, and then a gender by gifted interaction, with the outcome being middle school achievement. I had the great fortune to be able to access some of Jackie Ackel's data, Studies to Her Childhood and Beyond data set, which is a very, very impressive, large-scale longitudinal study. Began in the early mid to late 80s. It's a cohort sequential design. So what we did in order to examine trajectories from 1st to 6th grade annually is we ended up collapsing across cohorts. So very large sample, majority white, with about 173 gifted students. So the variables we used, we had IQ as a proxy, just a proxy for gifted status. We had motivational concepts that after we collapsed across cohorts, we're able to look at year to year. Middle school academic achievement. And then for underachievement, kind of the tricky part of this was figuring out how we were going to measure underachievement as a trajectory for itself. And they had this wonderful item where teachers reported every year for the child, how well is this child performing compared to how well you believe she could. So it's not just looking at achievement itself, but kind of this direct measure of discrepancy. So we reverse coded it where a low score is very achievy, and that's a word I just made up, so bear with me. Whereas a high score is very underachieving. So we just, it's too early not to laugh, so underachieving. So with this, and because we have this at each grade level, we're able to track changes in underachievement. Prior to this, longitudinal work with underachievement had only looked at it as either the start of something or the end at the end of the pathway. This is the first one we're actually tracking it over time. Very exciting. Here comes the statistical part. So when you ask big questions, you have to use very big analyses. So I learned a lot about latent class growth analysis, which is a type of growth mixture modeling. So what you're doing with this is, in traditional latent growth analysis, you make the assumption that growth parameters are normally distributed, that they come from one population. LCGA relaxes this assumption, and it says, we're making the assumption now that these growth parameters might come from distinct populations, perhaps an underachievement population and an achievement population, or more. So you allow for the possibility of latent classes, not just at one time point, but of change. Because that wasn't complicated enough, we made parallel process LCGA models, where the determination of classes is based on underachievement and the corresponding motivational belief. And then once not enough, we did 4. So each model had underachievement and a corresponding motivational belief. The goal was not to test competing models, so we weren't interested in the best model. We were interested in looking across these models and seeing how underachievement changes along with these motivational beliefs. Models were estimated simultaneously with predictors, so gender gifted, gender by gifted interaction term, and a distal correlate, typically to help comp middle school achievement. So what you do with LCGA is you begin with the assumption that there's just one latent class of change, examine fit indices, and then you test an increasing number of classes use fit indices between and within classes to determine what is the best appropriate number of classes. Because these models are likely to just come up with classes, theory and hypotheses are very important. So we expected that there would at least be an achievement trajectory and an underachievement trajectory. So theory still remains very important for this. So the first question, we're looking at these joint development in these two constructs across all the models. So we hypothesized that there would be at least one underachievement trajectory, whether that was growing over time or sustained, and then an achievement trajectory. And then possibly that there might be multiple kinds of underachievement trajectories. For the final class solutions, I almost had a consistent 3-class solution across all 4, but we can't all be that lucky. So in 3 of the models, the best solution was a 3-class solution. And then for the model with self-worth, there was a 2-class solution. And because the number of classes is jointly determined by growth in both constructs, it seems like it's not hugely problematic that we didn't consistently find the same thing for everyone. To give you a preview of what we found, we did find an achievement type trajectory consistently across all 4 models. So that was good. Students whose amount of underachievementness was low over time, so they were working up to their full ability kind of consistently across time. And then the most exciting part, we did find some evidence to suggest potentially 2 different kinds of underachievement pathways. And they did map onto our expectations. So sustained, start off very underachieving, remain underachieving across time, as well as growing underachievement, start off not underachieving, but get underachieving over time. That one only showed up in 2 models, so again, just this is primarily exploratory, taking it into consideration, but it was exciting we found partial evidence for these. So I'm going to walk through the plotted latent classes of growth now for each of the 4 models. So this is just to orient you. The first model where we looked at underachievement and self-concept. So you'll see over here on the left, this is plotting the estimated curves for each class for underachievement. So the low end of the y-axis is working to the maximum of your ability, whereas the high end of the y-axis is very underachieving. So lower is better achieving. Over here we see the corresponding trajectories for that simultaneous process, self-concept, where low on the y-axis is low self-concept, high is high self-concept. This is for reading. So the arrows are pointing here to this first class. So over on the left-hand side, you can see this is the trajectory that we're calling the achievement class. Start off not very underachieving, remain not very underachieving, so working to your potential. And you see correspondingly on the right-hand side, they start off with pretty high academic self-concept for reading. It declines just slightly over time. Pretty consistent with what we know, right? Motivation kind of declines a little bit across the elementary school years, from 1st to 6th grade. The next class we're looking at, and I used red to denote the sustained underachievement class, is sustained underachievement. So this is where they start off pretty underachieving and kind of remain pretty underachieving over time. And what's so cool, I think, is that they share a very similar self-concept pathway to the achieving pattern, which is very interesting, not what we would have expected. In contrast, it's this sort of growing underachievement class that's the one that they start off a little bit lower in self-concept and decline over time. This kind of leads now to interesting questions about which one comes first, the self-concept, the underachievement. If you start off underachieving, do you maybe not notice? Is it something about emerging over time? So again, this dissertation left me with more questions than I started with, but that's what we would all hope for, right? Keeps that program of research going. So that's the self-concept model. Task importance, we found findings that were very similar to the self-concept model. So we find those same 3 underachievement trajectories. There's our achievement trajectory. Again, start off high, task importance, reading is meaningful to me, important to me, it declines slightly. And that same interesting pattern for the sustained. So even though underachievement is relatively high over time and remains that way, don't really have much of a detriment in task importance that shows a similar decline over time. So they're looking pretty adaptive, which is interesting. And yet when we look at this growing underachievement class, they start off lower in task importance and decline over time. So again, it's something about that emerging underachievement over time. The self-concept and the task importance models are the only two where we see this growing underachievement pattern. Psychological cost. This one was also very interesting. We got two achievement trajectories. You can see them on the left-hand side, pretty low. They had different trajectories in psychological cost. So again, you can't just generalize to all achieving students, all achieving patterns. They look differently in their subtypes. So first is our achievement class that has kind of a little bit of an increase in psychological costs, kind of quadratically over time. Then we see our sustained underachieving student pattern. So this is high underachievement over time. These are kind of the same trajectory as the achievement, a little bit higher in psychological cost. But then we get a second achievement trajectory. So they're doing well, but they kind of worry all the time. Sound familiar, anyone? High achieving, but stressed and super worried all the time. So we get this, to me, also emphasizes the need to take this person-centered approach. There's not just one relationship. It might be different kinds of patterns. And then self-worth is the trajectory where we only found two classes. The achievement class, which had moderately self-worth, kind of slight curve over time. And then underachievement, and slightly lower in self-worth over time. So in summarizing these, we can carefully generalize across the different patterns. So we look at the achievement pattern and the sustained underachievement pattern. We see fairly similar motivational trajectories when it comes to self-concept and task importance, which to me is very, very interesting and just makes me have more questions. For sustained underachievement, we see a little bit higher psychological cost value, worries about doing well reading, and a little bit lower self-worth than achievement. So kind of some self-worth related concerns when we're looking at chronic underachievement. When we think about growing achievement, because it only showed up in two models, we sort of carefully think about this pattern. And a little bit lower in this initial self-concept and task importance that kind of declined over time. So really the most important findings that stand out to me here are two different pathways in underachievement. And because we're looking broadly, and it's picking up on general patterns, there's probably more, which makes me even more excited to dig into those. But we're looking at patterns that generalize. When we look at predictors, that really didn't pan out much. We only found partial support for gender differences in terms of males being more likely to be classified into the sustained versus achievement, but really not that much. So it's kind of interesting to contrast that with what we know from the correlational research. The gifted variable was a great big failure. We found absolutely nothing, much to my dismay, my interest in gifted students. Our findings for the distal correlates of underachievement were pretty consistent with what we know from long-term longitudinal research. So students in the sustained underachievement class had lower middle school GPA than those who were in the achievement trajectory. Kind of makes sense, kind of common sense. What we know from McCall's research is that chronic underachievement does have long-term consequences. Makes sense. We were only able to look at later outcome differences between the two types of underachievement pathways in two models. This is only where it showed up. And we only found differences in GPA for one of those. So it's really just mild hint at the fact that the pathway you take to underachievement might matter for later outcomes. Certainly makes me want to look into this more. We didn't really get a very robust finding with that there. So now let's connect this back to everything we know about underachievement. Heterogeneity is important to look at, and important to look at longitudinally. So looking at these unique pathways. these principles of multifinality and equifinality turned out to really matter. So achieving and growing patterns started off in the same place, doing well, and one pattern diverged. What makes them diverge? I mean, this just raises so many questions. And then equifinality. Just because patterns look similar at the end of underachieving, they got there through different ways. So how do they respond differently to interventions? Again, it raises more questions. And then the antitypes, thinking about the patterns that we're not seeing. So we didn't see a pattern where students are starting off underachieving and got better. Doesn't mean that didn't happen, it just wasn't strong enough to emerge as a pattern. So again, with person-centered, you're always looking for what don't we see and why don't we see it. So for me, this has huge implications for how we think about research and underachievement. There's no single determinant because there's no one universal pathway. That it's a trajectory in itself, not just a starting point or an end point, which again is why I've changed the way I talk to say underachieving rather than underachiever. It does not reside within a person. It's a thing that fluctuates. And then looking at heterogeneity longitudinally. And so thinking from a practical standpoint, you can have two children sitting before you who look equally underachieving, but may have gotten there through totally different routes. So just keeping that in mind has, I think, huge implications. And this matters too if we think back about all of these observations that people have been making about why interventions for underachieving students kind of work. So for example, some of them got better, some of them didn't. Well, that makes sense. If they came from different pathways, they're going to respond differently to different contexts. That's again a principle from person-centered research. So what that means is there's probably no one-size-fits-all approach to interventions for underachieving students. Which makes our job as researchers, especially with intervention, a little more challenging, but kind of exciting. So we can think about interventions then from two different lenses. And both of them are equally important. So in the first lens, we're thinking about intervening on variables. And this is what most of the interventions do. So my colleagues at UT and one of my graduate students and I are doing this meta-analysis looking all the way back to the 1950s on how effective have interventions been at reversing underachievement in these variables. And most of them purport to change underachievement by acting on a variable. Self-concept, anxiety, literally the kitchen sink. And we find preliminary analyses, they're kind of effective and haven't really gotten more so since the 50s. Surprising. But that's only one way to look at interventions. The second way is to remember that you're intervening on people, not just variables. Variables exist within people, they exist holistically with people. So the future of interventions then become, how can we match the intervention to the type of underachieving student? Some research has started to look at this to say, okay, what's your issue? Is it value? Is it self-concept? Is it self-regulation? And trying to match that. And then the real big push beyond that is not just people, but if we think about this principle of equifinality, pathways. Even though you look similar in land now, you probably got there. So that's the extra double challenge for interventions. How can we match it to your pathway? So after talking about this person-centered approach, this variable-centered approach, it's really important to remember that these approaches work synergistically. So back when I was a doctoral student and learning about this person-centered research, I asked a really naive and kind of stupid question where I thought, oh, we're done with variable-centered research, right? We have this person-centered stuff, it's really cool, that's the end. It's a naive question because they work together. So this has really been emphasized by person-centered researchers, saying that the two approaches should be complementary. So if we think about it as a cycle, the purpose of variable-centered research can be to look for these general principles, and then if you're going the person-centered route, be mindful of where there's heterogeneity. Where you see a lot of variability, dig down in that. You could follow up with variable-centered of isolating the mechanism, and then person-centered, carefully generalize to similar individuals. Look for these patterns, look for these antitypes, and think about people versus variables. So they're both equally important, they work together. So just as an illustration of how I see this working in my own research, again thinking about underachievement, as part of the theoretical proposal of looking at multiple pathways in underachievement, taking this person-centered approach, one pathway that Lisa and I proposed was that maladaptive messages about giftedness, what it means to be gifted, is one beginning of a pathway to underachievement. You get these maladaptive ideas that giftedness is something static, leads to these kind of weird motivational beliefs, and then coping mechanisms like self-handicapping that undermine achievement. So just a personal example, when I was in high school, I didn't know it, I had a very entity view of intelligence, and I had this one academic failure that resulted in me telling my biology teacher I had hit the ceiling of my intelligence. So it's no wonder what I studied. So trying to avoid that kind of pathway. So once we had proposed this, kind of cobbling together the evidence, we tried to isolate this causal mechanism. So we conducted a study, an experimental study with college students in the lab, where we're looking at, do entity messages about giftedness lead to self-handicapping under failure conditions? And we found evidence for this. So what I was careful to do in the conclusion for that paper was not to say, this is how underachievement happens, but this is one means through which it happens. So again, carefully generalized. That kind of led to this related question of, well, are implicit beliefs about giftedness different from implicit beliefs about intelligence? Still an eye on underachievement. I'll show you those findings quickly, the variable-centered approach, and then the cycle when it returns to person-centered, looking at the data in red. So this is a study that's in press with colleagues at Duke Tip. So what we did to test this, our implicit beliefs about giftedness, different than implicit beliefs about intelligence, is we gave academically talented adolescents the typical direct scale, referring to intelligence, and then the same scale, but we replaced the word intelligence with giftedness. Super cool. The variable-centered questions, which is the primary purpose of the paper, was, are they distinct? So we found that they are positively correlated. So on the whole, if you have entity beliefs about one, typically entity beliefs about another, and that comparatively, mean level, average, more entity view of giftedness as opposed to intelligence. And that's the variable-centered question overall, for general principles. But because I have my eye on this person-centered stuff, especially underachievement, what I think is most fascinating is digging into the actual plotted data themselves. So x-axis, implicit beliefs about giftedness, incremental's low end, entity's high end, y-axis is intelligence. So we do see in general, they kind of follow the same thing. But if you look for patterns, this is where I get so excited. So bottom left-hand side, dual incremental theories. Top right-hand side, dual entity theories. But look on the off diagonals. So if we look on the off right diagonal, entity view of giftedness, but you have this incremental view of intelligence. You have almost these competing views. So now the focus is in the variable, but in the patterns within the person. And if we look for anti-types, anti-patterns, white spots, top left-hand corner, not as common to have an entity view of intelligence and an incremental view of giftedness. So I started thinking of all these person-centered questions, especially knowing what we know about how these relate to underachievement. Does it matter if you have a dual entity view? If you have a competing view, does one buffer? So always thinking about the patterns and then how they got there. So for me, the variable-centered approach is what I use to help me in my hunt for person-centered principles. So I do see them as synergistic, and not as I naively asked from done with variable-centered research. So for concluding thoughts about what this means, indeed, underachievement is hugely complex. But we've been saying it's complex for decades now. There was actually someone a few decades ago that said, can you please stop it with a correlational approach? We're done. You know that. We need to look at mechanisms. When you have something that's so complex, you sometimes need a paradigm shift to look at it in a new way. And for me, that involves variable-centered and person-centered approach to think about this holistically, so we target it with a multifaceted approach. So I do see them working together, and that's how I see them fitting in my broader program of research. And so with apologies to my mother, I have not come up with a solution for underachievement yet. I know she tasked me with that, and I'm like 3 years overdue. And I don't even know that I can come up with one. But hopefully what I've done is added new questions to the conversation. So we can start a new conversation about what underachievement means, so that more people can start taking this person-centered approach and integrating the variable-centered approach, that hopefully someday we can find at least some solutions for underachievement. And so I would like to acknowledge, most importantly, my advisor, Lisa Winter, Garcia, who was wonderfully instrumental in my thinking and provided me so much support through my graduate school years. My dissertation committee, especially Myron and Carrie, provided a lot of assistance and guidance to me, so again, I do stand on the shoulders of giants. And then I am so grateful to Jackie Apples and her colleagues for allowing me access to these data, because it really was the best way to get into these